A 73-year-old man stands on a sidewalk. He has swept every morning for as long as anyone can remember. He is not armed. He is not threatening anyone. He holds a paper bag with his blood pressure medication inside. Then a police cruiser pulls up. An officer steps out and slaps him so hard his glasses shatter on the concrete. The whole town sees it on video. The police chief calls it a misunderstanding. The mayor says, "Let the process work." But nobody, not one single person in that courtroom, knew that the old man's youngest son had just arrived from Quantico. Nobody knew what badge he carried in his jacket pocket until he walked through that door. Harlan Crow had lived on Cypress Street in Delwood, Georgia for a long time. He had moved there with his wife Lillian when Delwood was still the kind of town where a black family settling onto a quiet street made curtains shift in neighboring windows and conversations drop to whispers at the hardware store. Harlan had survived all of it. The whispers, the anonymous notes left on his porch, the evening someone spray-painted a single ugly word across his mailbox. He survived because he was the kind of man who answered ugliness with consistency. He rose early every morning. He swept his porch and the sidewalk in front of his house. He grew tomatoes in the side yard. He volunteered at Calvary Baptist Church every Sunday, running the food pantry with Lillian until she passed from breast cancer. And then he ran it alone. At 73, Harlan Crow was not a large man. He stood 5'8" and had lost weight since Lillian died, weight he could not seem to regain, no matter how many casseroles the church ladies brought. He wore thick-framed glasses because his eyes had begun to fail him. He walked with a slight lean to the left from an old back injury earned during decades at the Fulton County Water Treatment Plant. He had retired with a modest pension, a plaque on the wall, and the quiet respect of every man and woman who had worked under him. One morning, Harlan had a single errand. He needed to pick up his blood pressure prescription from Aldridge Pharmacy on Commerce Avenue, only a few blocks from home. His doctor had called personally the day before to remind him not to skip the refill. His pressure had been running high. He needed to stay on schedule. Harlan put on his good brown coat, the one Lillian had bought him for their anniversary, tucked the pharmacy receipt into his pocket, and walked out into a cool Georgia morning. He never made it back home standing straight. Declan Voss had been with the Delwood Police Department for years. In that time, he had accumulated the kind of record that small Georgia departments once tolerated, and sometimes quietly celebrated. Multiple use-of-force complaints, several formal grievances filed by citizens, most of them black, 2 settlements paid out by the city's insurance fund, both for traffic stops that escalated in ways the dash cam footage never quite captured cleanly. His sergeant had once described Voss in an annual review as aggressive but effective, which in the culture of the Delwood PD meant he cleared calls fast and did not ask too many questions about how. Voss was in his 40s. He was the son of a former Delwood cop. He bowled on Thursday nights with other officers and 2 city council members. He had a thin blue line tattoo on his left forearm and had once kept a Confederate flag phone case until a department memo forced him to switch it for plain black, though a small rebel flag sticker remained on the rear window of his personal truck. That morning, Voss was on routine patrol when he pulled his cruiser onto Commerce Avenue. He would later claim he had received a dispatch call about a suspicious individual matching Harlan Crow's description, an older black man loitering near the pharmacy. The dispatch log would become a central piece of evidence because it showed no such call had ever been made. What it showed was that Voss had self-initiated the stop. He pulled over. He got out. He walked up to Harlan Crow, who stood at the corner of Commerce and 3rd, waiting for the crosswalk signal with a paper pharmacy bag in his hand. Hey, old man, what are you doing?" Harlan turned. He had seen police officers approach him before. He knew in the way every black man of his generation knew how to keep his hands visible, his voice calm, and his eyes direct, but not challenging. He had taught this to his sons the way his own father had taught it to him, an inheritance no man should have to pass down. Yet all of them did. "Just picked up my prescription," Harlan said. "Heading home. You got ID?" "I do." Harlan moved slowly, deliberately, to reach into his coat pocket. What happened next was captured on the phone camera of Destiny Rivera, a young pharmacy technician on her lunch break across the street. Her phone was already up because she had seen Voss approach, and something in her stomach had tightened. The footage is short. Harlan Crow reaches into his coat pocket. He produces not a weapon, not a threat that threw it, but his Georgia state ID and the pharmacy receipt. The receipt bearing his name, his doctor's name, and the medication. He holds both out toward Officer Voss. Voss does not take them. Instead, he says something. The audio is partially obscured by street noise, but forensic analysts would later enhance it and testify to what they heard. "Don't get smart with me, boy." And then he slaps Harlan Crow across the face. Open hand. Hard. The crack of it is audible on the recording. Harlan stumbles backward. His glasses fly off his face and shatter when they hit the curb. He hits the wall of the building behind him and slides partially down it before catching himself. The pharmacy bag drops. The pill bottle rolls into the street. Destiny Rivera is heard on the video gasping, then screaming. Several other people on the street stop walking. A car slows. Voss looks around. He sees the phone. He sees the people. He gets back into his cruiser and drives away without filing a report. By that evening, Destiny Rivera's video had been viewed hundreds of thousands of times. By the next day, it was millions. When Harlan Crow sat at his kitchen table with a bruise across his left cheek and his spare pair of glasses taped at the bridge, his name was already being spoken on national news and every local affiliate between Atlanta and Savannah. The Delwood Police Department released a statement. Chief Grant Ellison, a veteran of the department who had hired Voss and signed off on each of Voss's cleared complaints, stood at a podium and said, "We are aware of a video circulating on social media depicting an interaction between one of our officers and a community member. We take all allegations of misconduct seriously and have initiated an internal review. Officer Voss has been placed on paid administrative leave pending the outcome of that review. We ask the community to allow the process to work." He did not say Harlan Crow's name. He did not call it an assault. He did not answer questions. Mayor Pierce Holt released a written statement from his office that was short and contained the phrase, "ongoing investigation" twice. He did not call Harlan Crow either. Harlan's oldest son, Desmond Crow, a high school principal in Atlanta, drove to Delwood that same day. He sat across the table from his father, held the old man's hands, and listened as Harlan described what had happened in the flat, measured tone of a man who had spent decades learning not to let his rage spill over, because he knew what spilling over cost a black man in this country. "He called me boy," Harlan said. Desmond stared at the table. "I'm 73 years old," Harlan said. "I worked decades, and I paid my taxes, and I buried your mother, and I still can't walk a few blocks to pick up my medicine." Desmond called an attorney, a civil rights lawyer named Isaiah Kane out of Atlanta, who had handled high-profile police misconduct cases. Kane drove down that afternoon, reviewed the video, reviewed Voss's record, and told Harlan Crow he had one of the strongest cases he had ever seen. But Kane had worked in Georgia long enough to know that strong cases and just outcomes were not the same thing. What nobody in the room mentioned, what Desmond had deliberately not mentioned yet, was their younger brother. Because their younger brother worked for the Federal Bureau of Investigation, and he was already on his way. Quentin Crow was in his 40s and had been a special agent with the FBI's Civil Rights Division for years. He had not always been FBI. He had gone to Georgia Tech on an academic scholarship, graduated with a degree in criminal justice, done time with the Georgia Bureau of Investigation, and then passed the FBI entrance exam on his first attempt. He had worked out of the Atlanta field office before being recruited to the Civil Rights Division in Washington, where his particular expertise, pattern analysis in law enforcement misconduct cases, especially in jurisdictions with histories of systemic discrimination, had made him one of the more respected analysts in his unit. He was not a headline agent. He was not the kind of FBI agent you saw on the news giving press conferences. He was the kind of agent who spent long periods building a case so airtight that when it finally went to a grand jury, it did not fail. He had been part of teams that brought federal charges against police officers in several states. He understood how these cases worked. He understood how they were won and lost. He also understood something more personal. He had grown up watching his father navigate this country with patience and dignity and grace. And he had always known, in the way children of black men of his father's generation always knew, that one day the country might show his father exactly what it thought of all that patience and dignity and grace. He had hoped he was wrong. When Desmond called him, Quentin was already watching the video on his laptop in his apartment in Virginia. He had been watching it for some time. He had watched it multiple times. "I'm coming," he said, before Desmond had finished the first sentence. "Quentin, you don't have to." "I'm coming." He called his supervisor, Assistant Special Agent in Charge, Donna Reed, before he booked his travel. He told her what had happened. He told her he was going to Georgia as a family member, not as an ad agent, but that he was flagging it because she needed to know. Reed was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Keep me informed. And Quentin, document everything." He understood what she meant. He arrived in Atlanta, rented a car, and drove to Delwood. He did not announce himself. He did not go to the police department. He did not speak to any press. He went to his father's house, sat at the same kitchen table where Desmond was already sitting, and held his father the way a federal agent holds the man who taught him how to be a man, which is to say silently, and for a long time. The preliminary hearing for the civil complaint filed by Isaiah Kane on behalf of Harlan Crow was held in the Delwood Municipal Courthouse, a building that still carried the faint smell of old wood and old decisions in its walls. Declan Voss sat at the defense table with his attorney, a man named Stuart Hale, who specialized in representing law enforcement officers in Georgia and had a record of making cases like this one disappear. Hale was expensive and he was good, and the Delwood Police Benevolent Association was paying his full rate. Voss had, in the time since the incident, given one statement to the internal affairs investigator in which he claimed Harlan had been moving erratically and that he had lost his footing during what Voss described as a routine field interview. He did not explain how a man losing his footing produced a bruise in the exact shape and distribution of an open-hand strike across the left cheek. He did not address the audio enhancement of the word boy. Chief Grant Ellison sat in the gallery behind Voss in his full-dress uniform. Mayor Pierce Holt was not present, but two of his aides were. The courtroom was packed. Calvary Baptist Church had organized a quiet, dignified showing of support. Dozens of Harlan's fellow congregants, most of them elderly, sitting in pressed Sunday clothes in the gallery behind the plaintiff's table. Local press was present. 2 Atlanta television cameras were set up in the back. Harlan Crow sat next to Isaiah Kane in a charcoal gray suit that Lillian had picked out for him years earlier. His spare glasses were still taped at the bridge. Desmond sat in the first row of the gallery, directly behind him. Quentin sat rows back. He wore a plain dark jacket and slacks. Nobody except his brother knew who he was or what he carried in the inside pocket of that jacket. The hearing began. Judge Alana Moore, a woman who had been on the Delwood municipal bench for years, called the room to order. The first hour was procedural. Motions from Hale to limit the scope of the video evidence. Motions from Kane to introduce Voss's prior complaint history. Judge Moore ruled on each with the careful neutrality of a judge who was aware of how many cameras were in her courtroom. Then Stuart Hale did something nobody had anticipated. He called a witness. The witness was a man named Carl Brennan, a white man who claimed to have been standing on Commerce Avenue the morning of the incident. Brennan testified in a voice just confident enough to sound rehearsed without quite sounding scripted that he had seen Harlan Crow acting aggressive toward Officer Voss, that Harlan had raised his voice and moved toward the officer in a threatening manner, and that what he had seen on the video did not capture what had really happened because the angle was wrong. The gallery stirred. Isaiah Kane let Brennan finish. Then stood up. "Mr. Brennan, where exactly were you standing?" Brennan gave an intersection. "And what time did you arrive at that intersection?" Brennan gave a time. Kane picked up a document. "Mr. Brennan, are you aware that the Commerce Avenue intersection has a city-maintained traffic camera on the southwest corner?" The courtroom went quiet. Hale was already on his feet. "Objection, Your Honor. Foundation?" Kane was already handing the document to the clerk. "Your Honor, I'd like to introduce footage from the Commerce Avenue municipal traffic camera from the morning of the incident, obtained via public records request to the Delwood Department of Transportation." Judge Moore looked at the document. She looked at Hale. "Overruled. I'll allow it." The footage was played. Carl Brennan was not on Commerce Avenue at the time on the day of the incident. Not at the intersection he named. Not at any intersection on the block. The gallery erupted. Judge Moore banged her gavel. Hale's face had gone the color of old chalk. Kane turned to face Brennan in the witness stand. "Mr. Brennan, who asked you to testify today?" "Objection." I'll rephrase. "Mr. Brennan, have you ever spoken with Officer Declan Voss or any member of the Delwood Police Department prior to today?" Brennan's jaw moved. He said nothing. "Mr. Brennan, I know some of the guys from the department socially." "Socially," Kane repeated. In the gallery, Quentin Crow was writing something in a small notebook. His expression had not changed. The hearing recessed for lunch. During the recess, Stuart Hale received a phone call in the courthouse parking lot. Court security cameras recorded him pacing during the call and then standing very still for the last seconds of it. When court reconvened, Hale informed the judge that his client wished to make a statement. Voss stood. He had prepared something, a folded piece of paper he held in both hands. He read from it in a voice clearly aimed at the cameras in the back of the room. "I want to acknowledge that the interaction I had with Mr. Crow on that day did not reflect the professional standards of the Delwood Police Department, and I regret any distress it caused to Mr. Crow and his family. I have the utmost respect for the community." "Excuse me," the voice came from the back of the courtroom. Every head turned. Quentin Crow was standing. He was not looking at Voss. He was looking at Judge Moore. "Your Honor, I apologize for the interruption. My name is Quentin Crow. Harlan Crow is my father." He reached into the inside pocket of his jacket. He produced his credentials, the leather fold, the gold badge, the FBI identification card, and held them up so the judge could see them clearly. "I'm a special agent with the Federal Bureau of Investigation, Civil Rights Division. I'm here today as a family member, not in an official capacity. But I want to inform the court that as of this morning, I submitted a formal referral to my division recommending a federal civil rights investigation into this incident and into the broader pattern of conduct complaints against Officer Voss and the Delwood Police Department." The courtroom did not erupt this time. It went completely, utterly silent. Declan Voss's face, the face of a man who had slapped a 73-year-old across the face on a public street and driven away, who had been protected by his department and his union, and a false witness, went the color of ash. Chief Grant Ellison, sitting in full dress uniform in the gallery, put both hands flat on his knees. Hale stood up. "Your Honor, this is completely improper." Judge Moore held up one hand. She was looking at Quentin Crowe with an expression no one in the room could entirely read, something between recognition and something that might have been, under her judicial composure, relief. "Agent Crowe," she said carefully, "you're here as a private citizen today." "Yes, Your Honor, but the referral you mentioned, that's a matter of federal record. Filed this morning, Your Honor. Case reference number available to any party who requests it through official channels." Hale sat down slowly, like a man who suddenly understood the floor might not hold him. Quentin sat down too. He looked at his father's back, the thin brown coat, the taped glasses, the straight-held spine of a man who had been getting up and sweeping his sidewalk through everything this country had thrown at him. Harlan Crowe did not turn around, but he reached back with one hand and held it out, and Quentin took it. What followed was not television drama. It was the quieter, more thorough kind of dismantling, the kind that happens in federal records requests, in depositions, in the careful examination of phone records and department logs and emails that people wrote assuming no one with real authority would ever read them. The FBI's Civil Rights Division opened a formal pattern or practice investigation into the Delwood Police Department. The investigation was assigned to a team of agents and a supervising attorney named Margaret Kane, who had spent years in the Justice Department and had led similar investigations in other states. Kane's team began by pulling every use of force report filed in the Delwood PD. What they found was not surprising to anyone who had been paying attention, but it was documented now in the precise and prosecutable language of federal review. Of the use of force incidents recorded in the Delwood PD, most involved Black or Latino civilians. Of Voss's complaints specifically, most had been filed by Black civilians. Of the formal grievances that had gone through the city's process, most had been downgraded to unfounded or officer justified by the same internal affairs investigator, a sergeant named Thomas Brennan, who had also been Vance Voss's training officer when Voss joined the department. Thomas Brennan retired abruptly after receiving a federal subpoena. Chief Grant Ellison did not retire. He was given the opportunity in a closed meeting with the city attorney, Mayor Holt, and a representative from the FBI field office. He chose instead to fight it, which was his right. He retained an attorney and issued a public statement defending his department's record. It was the wrong decision, because Kane's team by this point had the emails. The emails were from the departmental server, obtained via federal subpoena, and they spanned years. They were not individually the kind of emails that made immediate headlines. They were instead the accumulation of a culture. Jokes that weren't jokes. Language that was consistent and directional. References to Black civilians in terms not fit to reproduce. Specific discussions between Ellison and Voss and other officers about how to document stops in ways that would be defensible. A word that appeared multiple times across the chain. The emails also contained, buried in a thread from the previous year, a discussion about Harlan Crowe specifically. Harlan Crowe, who had attended city council meetings to speak during public comments about a proposed reduction in Delwood's public transit routes that would affect elderly residents, had apparently attracted the attention of someone in the department. The thread, initiated by an officer whose name would later be redacted in public reporting, but not in the federal case file, referred to Harlan as "that old agitator on Cyprus," and included a response from Voss that said simply, "I know who he is. I got it." Months before the incident on Commerce Avenue, Declan Voss had been assigned to patrol the Commerce-Cyprus corridor. It had not been random. When this information became public through a carefully managed leak to the Atlanta Journal-Constitution that originated from a source no one ever officially identified, though Isaiah Kane received an anonymous text message hours before the story ran that said simply, "Check your email." The Delwood story changed entirely. It stopped being a story about one cop having a bad morning. It became something older and more deliberate and more damning. Declan Voss was indicted by a federal grand jury on counts of deprivation of rights under color of law. The federal statute used to prosecute law enforcement officers who violate constitutional rights. The specific charge related to the assault on Harlan Crow. A second count, added by the grand jury on its own motion after reviewing the email evidence, alleged a pattern of racially motivated selective enforcement. Stuart Hale held a press conference outside the federal courthouse in Atlanta and used phrases like prosecutorial overreach and good officer and political climate. He looked like a man reading words he did not fully believe. Chief Grant Ellison resigned. The city issued a statement thanking him for his service. Mayor Pierce Holt announced he would not seek re-election. The city of Delwood, Georgia, reached a civil settlement with Harlan Crow. The amount was not disclosed publicly, but Isaiah Kane confirmed it was substantial and included, at Harlan's specific request, 3 non-monetary provisions: a permanent civilian oversight board for the Delwood PD, mandatory body camera activation policies, and a public acknowledgement on city letterhead signed by the mayor that Harlan Crow had done nothing wrong on that day, that he had been targeted, and that the city was sorry. The letter took hours to negotiate. Harlan Crow framed it and hung it in his kitchen, next to a photograph of Lillian. The law handled what the law could handle. But there were other things that happened in the margins of the official record that were, in their own way, as consequential. Carl Brennan, the false witness, was charged with perjury in Georgia State Court. His attorney negotiated a plea to a lesser charge. Brennan was sentenced to community service hours. He performed some of those hours at the Calvary Baptist Church food pantry, where Harlan Crow still volunteered every Sunday. On one Sunday there, Brennan arrived to find Harlan Crow already at the distribution table stacking cans. They did not speak for the first hours. Then, during a break, Brennan sat on a folding chair near the door with a cup of coffee, and Harlan walked past him, and Brennan said quietly, "I'm sorry, Mr. Crow." Harlan stopped. He looked at this man, clearly frightened, clearly ashamed, clearly not fully aware of what he had inserted himself into when he agreed to lie for Declan Voss in exchange for what the indictment later revealed was a promise of a reference for a city contract bid. Harlan said, "I know you are." He poured himself a cup of coffee and sat down in the chair next to Brennan, and they sat there for minutes, not saying much. Then they went back to work. This is not in any court record. Destiny Rivera, the pharmacy technician who filmed the original video, knew about it because she had started volunteering at the pantry herself, partly out of guilt for the time it had taken her to post the video publicly, partly because she had met Harlan at the civil hearing and found him to be, in her words to a friend, the kind of person who makes you want to be better. Destiny was applying to nursing school. Thomas Brennan, the retired internal affairs sergeant, cooperated with federal investigators in exchange for immunity from prosecution. His cooperation was what gave Kane's team the specific knowledge that the use of force reviews had been deliberately manipulated. He gave a deposition that lasted hours across days. He cried during it. Once, when he described clearing a complaint against Voss for an incident involving a teenager named Eli Vale who had been pulled from his bicycle during a stop and had his wrist broken, and once when an investigator asked him if he had ever been afraid to tell the truth. Eli Vale's family was contacted by Kane's office. His case was reopened. The other officers named in the email chain were placed on administrative suspension, pending the outcome of the federal investigation. One resigned. Another was ultimately not charged federally, but was terminated by the city following the investigation's public report, which named him by name in connection with specific incidents. Declan Voss's trial was scheduled later. He rejected plea offers. His attorney, Hale, had begun to quietly distance himself from the case. His firm released a statement announcing that due to conflicts, he would be withdrawing as counsel. Voss was eventually represented by a public defender, a young woman named Alicia Holt, who was only years out of law school, had never tried a federal civil rights case, and spent the months before trial reading case law until her eyes ached. She did her best. Her best was not enough. On the day of trial, the prosecution played the enhanced audio of the word boy. They played the email chain. They introduced testimony from Eli Vale, now a young man, speaking in a voice that was controlled and clear and devastating about what it had felt like to have his bicycle knocked out from under him and his wrist grabbed and twisted, while he asked what he had done wrong and received no answer. The jury deliberated for hours. Declan Voss was convicted on both counts. He was sentenced to years in federal prison. He served every day of it. There are things that do not resolve the way justice is supposed to resolve them. The law has a shape to it, a beginning, a middle, an end, a filing date, a hearing, a verdict, a sentence. It moves in one direction, and it arrives somewhere you can point to on a calendar. Settlement reached. Chief resigned. Mayor not seeking re-election. You can write those things in a column, and they look like resolution. They look like the world correcting itself. But Harlan Crow still woke up early every morning. He still made his coffee in the same percolator Lillian had bought at a garage sale, the one Desmond kept telling him to replace, and that he kept not replacing, because the coffee it made tasted exactly right. He still stood at the kitchen window while it brewed and looked out at the side yard, where his tomato plants were either coming in well or not, depending on the rain. He still put on his brown coat when the mornings were cool. He still walked to Aldridge Pharmacy when he needed his prescription, because it was a few blocks away, and he was not going to stop walking blocks to do what he had always done. He had decided that the morning after the incident, lying in bed with ice on his cheek, and he had not revisited the decision since. The bruise healed. These things always heal. It went from a deep reddish purple in the first days, the color of a thunderhead, to a flatter older purple, then to the yellowed green of something fading, then to nothing. His skin took it and absorbed it the way skin absorbs most things, quietly and without asking for recognition. His new glasses were lighter than the old ones. Desmond had driven him to the optometrist and insisted on paying for the good frames, and Harlan had let him, because Desmond needed to do something useful with his hands during that period, and buying his father good glasses was something useful. They fit well. The lenses were a slightly updated prescription, and the world came in a little sharper than it had been. Edges more defined, text easier, the faces of people across a room less blurred. He supposed there was something to be said for that. But some nights, not every night, not even most nights, but some, he sat at the kitchen table after the late news and felt something settle over him that he could not name with the precision he would have preferred. Harlan Crow was a man who believed in naming things correctly. He had run the water treatment plants division for years, and the first thing he had taught every new hire was, if you don't know what the problem is, name it exactly, because a vague diagnosis produces a vague fix, and a vague fix produces the same problem on a longer timeline. So he sat with this feeling and tried to name it honestly. It was not bitterness. He had made a decision about bitterness decades ago, sometime in his late 30s, after a particular incident at the plant, where a white supervisor years his junior had been promoted over him for a position Harlan had applied for, and was, by every measurable standard, more qualified to hold. He had felt bitterness then, The real thing, sharp-edged and hot. He had sat with it for weeks, and then he had looked at it clearly and understood that it would cost more than it was worth, not because the anger behind it was wrong. The anger was entirely right, but because bitterness turned the anger inward, and inward was the wrong direction. He had let it go. Not the anger, just the bitterness. He had kept the anger and put it somewhere useful. It was not grief either, though grief was always present in a background way since Lillian. Grief had a specific texture he knew well by now, the way it ambushed you in grocery stores when you reflexively reached for the brand of crackers she liked, the way it lived in the particular afternoon light of a Sunday when she would have been in the kitchen and the house would have been full of a certain kind of sound. He knew grief. This was adjacent to grief, but not the same thing. What it was, he finally decided. Sitting at the table with a cup of chamomile tea, the verdict still fresh, was the exhaustion of having been right about the danger for decades. There is no satisfaction in that kind of rightness. He had told his sons when they were young, told them the way his own father had told him, factually and without drama, the way you tell a child that a stove is hot, not to frighten them, but because they needed to know that this country had a particular relationship with black men, and that relationship required navigation. He had taught them how to put their hands where they could be seen. He had taught them how to keep their voice level and their eyes direct but not challenging. He had taught them not because he wanted to teach it, but because the alternative, sending them into the world without it, was a thing he could not do, and he had hoped every year that the lesson would become less necessary, that the world would shift enough that his grandsons, Desmond's boys, would not need to be taught the same thing. He was still hoping that. But hope and exhaustion can coexist in the same chest. And that night, they did. He finished his tea and washed the cup and went to bed. He went back to the food pantry the Sunday after the verdict. He had been going every Sunday for years, and he saw no reason to stop. Some of the church members had suggested gently that he might want to take some time, that he had been through something, that it was all right to rest. Harlan had listened to each of them with the full attention he gave everything, and then he had shown up early on Sunday morning to help unload the delivery van because the pantry opened and the cans did not stack themselves. The Sunday he was back, Carl Brennan arrived. Harlan had known Brennan would be coming. Isaiah Kane had informed him of the community service arrangement before it was finalized, giving Harlan the opportunity to object if he chose. Harlan had not objected. He had thought about it for a day, and then told Kane that it was fine, that the man should do his hours somewhere useful. What he had not anticipated was what it would feel like to see him walk through the door. Brennan was a medium-sized white man, with the look of someone who had spent months not sleeping well, a specific kind of worn quality around the eyes that Harlan recognized because he had seen it in mirrors. He came in quietly, spoke to the church volunteer coordinator, a woman named Harriet Brooks, and was given an apron and a set of tasks, and went to work without making eye contact with anyone. Harlan watched him from across the room for a while, not with malice, more the way you watch something you are trying to understand. They worked in the same building for hours without speaking. The pantry was busy that morning. It often was at the end of the month when money ran thin, and there was enough to do that silence between two people who did not know each other was unremarkable. Harlan worked his station. Brennan worked his. During the break, Harlan poured himself coffee and walked toward the door to get some air. Brennan was sitting there on a folding chair with his own cup and his eyes on the floor, and he said it without looking up. "I'm sorry, Mr. Crow." Harlan stopped. He looked at this man, clearly frightened, clearly ashamed, clearly not fully aware of what he had inserted himself into when he agreed to lie for Declan Voss in exchange for what the indictment later revealed was a promise of a reference for a city contract bid. Harlan said, "I know you are." He poured himself a cup of coffee and sat down in the chair next to Brennan. And they sat there for minutes, not saying much. Then they went back to work. Harlan did not tell Desmond or Quentin about it, not because he was hiding it, but because it felt like something that did not need to be packaged into a story. It had happened. It was its own thing. It belonged to that Sunday morning, and the folding chairs, and the rectangles of light on the floor. Quentin came down from Washington. He drove this time instead of flying. He said he had wanted the hours in the car to think, which Harlan understood. Quentin had always processed things best in motion, even as a child. He had been the one who needed to pace while he talked, who came home from school and walked the yard before he would say what kind of day it had been. Desmond drove down from Atlanta, and the three of them were together for the first time since the hearing. They ate ribs from a place on Main Road that did a dry rub Harlan had liked for a long time. They sat on the back porch as the afternoon went along, and the Georgia heat turned from the flat, white heat of midday into something softer, bronzed, the kind of heat that felt like the day deciding to let you go. They talked about the case, about Voss's trial, about the federal investigation report that would be made public soon, about Eli Vale and the fact that his family had finally been reached and his case reopened. They talked about Desmond's school, about a particular student Desmond was worried about, a teenager whose home situation sounded unstable. They talked about Quentin's next assignment, which he could not detail, but which would take him to a city in the Mid-South for several months. Then, the way it happens when family is comfortable with itself, they stopped talking about any of it, and just sat. The yard moved in a slight evening breeze. Harlan's tomatoes were coming in. A good year, better than the last. The rains having cooperated for once. Fireflies were beginning in the lower part of the yard near the fence, small, hesitant lights, trying themselves out against the dimming sky. "Dad?" Quentin was looking at the yard. "I need to ask you something." "Ask. Are you okay? Actually okay, not what you tell people?" Harlan let the question sit for a moment. He appreciated that Quentin had phrased it the way he had, the distinction between the performance of okay and the actual thing. Quentin had always been precise with language in the way that FBI agents became precise, which was also the way that honest people were precise. "I'm okay," Harlan said. "I'm tired. Been tired for a while. But I'm okay." Quentin nodded. He did not push, which was the right thing. "I'll tell you what I think about," Harlan said after a while. "I think about Destiny, that girl who filmed it. She told me when I met her at the hearing that she'd been standing there for almost a minute before she held up the phone. Almost a minute, watching it happen, being scared about what would happen if she filmed it, and what would happen if she didn't." He shook his head slowly. She was young, on her lunch break. She filmed it anyway. He looked at the fireflies. There's always somebody who films it, always somebody who tells the truth. The problem isn't that people don't see. It's that the people with the power to do something about what they see take their time about it. He paused. But Destiny didn't take her time. Eli didn't take his time when he testified. You didn't take your time. He glanced at Quentin. "You were already watching the video when Desmond called." "I know," Quentin said quietly. Harlan put his hand on his son's arm. "I know, son." They sat with that. "Your mother would have wanted every detail," Harlan said. His voice changed on her. It always did. Softened in a register he could not control, and had stopped trying to. She would have been in that courtroom in her good hat, the blue one with the brim. She would have sat right behind Isaiah Kane, and she would have looked at Declan Voss the whole time and never flinched. Desmond made a sound, something between a laugh and something else. "She would have brought food," he said. "She would have brought a whole pan of something for the church members who came, and she would have organized a carpool. She would have called the mayor herself, Quentin said. She would have called the mayor, Harlan agreed. And the mayor would have called her back, because everyone called Lillian Crow back. Everyone in their right mind returned Lillian Crow's calls. They were all laughing now, the way you laugh about someone gone fully without guilt, because they were worth remembering in full color and full sound. The laughter went out into the yard, over the tomatoes, up past the early dark, where the fireflies were doing their patient blinking work. Harlan looked at his garden. He thought about how many mornings he had come out here and put his hands in this dirt since she had been gone, and how the tomatoes had come anyway, and how that was either something comforting or something lonely depending on the day, and how most days lately it was both at once. He thought about the folding chair next to Carl Brennan. He thought about Destiny Rivera crossing the street with her uncomfortable gratitude and her open hand. He thought about Eli Vale and his bicycle. He thought about the letter on the wall in the kitchen. City letterhead, mayor's signature. The words, Harlan Crow did nothing wrong, in black ink that would last longer than the men who had to be compelled to write it. He thought about Lillian's photograph next to it. He stood up slowly, the back taking its time the way it did in the evenings now, and looked out at his yard in the dark. "Come on," he said to his sons. "Let me show you how the tomatoes came in." The three of them walked down the porch steps into the warm night, into the yard that Harlan Crow had kept for decades, on a street that had not always wanted him. And they walked among the plants in the dark, and the fireflies moved around them without agenda or meaning, blinking their small lights on and off, the way small lights do, persistent, patient, refusing to stop. Harlan Crow went to pick up his blood pressure medication and came home with a bruise on his face and a broken pair of glasses. He was 73 years old, a retired public servant, a widower, a churchman, a man who swept his sidewalk every morning. He was targeted deliberately, struck without cause, and then told by the systems designed to protect him to wait, to be patient, to let the process work. The process worked, but not the way they intended, because they did not know about Quentin. They did not know about Destiny and her phone. They did not know about Eli Vale and his bicycle, or the emails they had written, assuming no one would ever read them, or the jury that would sit and listen to all of it and come back with a verdict that said clearly, "Not this time." Harlan's story is not just one man's story. It is the story of what happens when ordinary people refuse to look away. When a young woman holds up her phone, when a son walks into a courtroom with a badge, when an old man sits on a folding chair next to the man who lied about him and says, "I know you are." If this story moved you, if it made you feel something, please like this video and share it. Share it with someone who needs to believe the truth, slow as it is. How to wait. Subscribe for more stories like this one, because they are everywhere, and they deserve to be told.